we're sitting here and we like don't have any lighting setup that looks at all accurate to what we would be expecting. You'll also notice that actually the shadows are pretty low resolution, and that might be frustrating because you might notice that if you go to Edit, Project Settings, Quality, a lot of the settings that you might have been used to from previous implementations are actually not here anymore. Like, you don't actually have settings for shadows, such as the shadow cascades or shadow resolution. And so a lot of the settings that used to be quality settings are actually seemingly not available anymore. So there are two ways of handling this, and I think that it's actually really cool once you get used to it. I think that you'll like it quite a lot. But one of them is that you can just create a setting object for this scene, and then the other option is you can start creating volumes or elements that actually modify it based on your current environment. So, for example, if I right-click, you'll notice that there's an option for rendering. There's something called a density volume, there's a decal projector, and then there's a scene settings. I'm going to go ahead and create the scene settings. And then you'll notice that right away, the lighting already looks a lot more like what you would expect from a default Unity lighting scene. So there's actually the sky now, there's the general kind of fog effects, and all of those types of things are incorporated. That's because the scene settings uses what's referred to as a volume to create these features. So let's just quickly go through that. First of all, the weight of the scene setting, and this is actually one of the things that's the main power here, is that you can actually change the contribution that the scene settings give to this environment overall. And that will look a little funny when you're just overriding all of the settings, but when you're doing this on purpose, for example, like for interior versus exterior, or for nighttime versus daytime, you can actually have a lot more control by handling this with the weight property. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of the settings here. So there's HD shadow settings. So this is actually where most of the settings that you might expect to see in the quality settings are actually moved to. So if I were to change the overall max shadow distance, I can do that here. If I want to change the number of shadow cascades, I can do that here. And if I want to change where the shadows actually split into the different cascades, you'll notice that if I'm looking here really close at the shadows, that I can see how the difference between those shadows progresses as I adjust the actual cascade distances. And so if you're familiar with shadow cascades, then you should already kind of have an idea of what's going on here. But basically the short answer is that we now have more control directly over how shadows get affected by these volumes that we can create. And it also allows you to change things per scene. It also allows you to easily enable and disable these settings, and then you can produce different variations. And in a second, we can see how that applies when you're creating different volumes. So let's take a look at the visual environment here. So visual environment is another component that you add to a volume. Right now we're using procedural sky, but you can also select HDRI sky, and then that allows you to pick an HDR sky as a component. So in this case, the visual environment has to actually be referencing a component. So if you have the procedural sky, that's actually referencing the procedural sky component here. If you have an HDRI sky, you actually have to go to add visual override, and you want to add the HDRI sky into that. And then if you have a cube map that you can use, like, so for example, in this case, that the only cube map I have in this scene is actually this one. But that allows me to have some control over how I'm affecting that HDRI sky. Obviously, I'm doing that in a little crazy kind of a context. But then you can also do the kind of rotation things, which will not show up so much with this one. But and then you can also change how those get updated. So it's like on change, on demand, or real time. So in this case, I'm probably going to stick with the procedural sky because that accomplishes what I need. Now, fog type, you can pick 3 different types: linear, exponential, volumetric. And those, again, if you want to add those in, you can add them in with the relevant linear fog, volumetric fog, and then there's also the volumetric lighting controller. So there's a number of settings that you can edit individually on this. So you can adjust the amount of density that the fog has, your fog minimum and maximum. You can set fog distances if you want it to be closer. There's also, again, this has a fog base height, which is really nice. So you can decide essentially how high up your fog is getting, and then you can adjust the fog attenuation, which will make it so that the height has more or less of a fade between different settings. So like if, for example, you're moving this fog way down, if you have fog attenuation, you'll notice how you can, as you shift that, you can see either a softer or a firmer cutoff between the fog, which is all really cool. Now the color mode is kind of neat because you can use both the sky color, which it makes a realistic effect, or you can use a constant color, which allows you to have more direct control over what those colors are. So I can make my fog whatever bizarre color I might think makes sense. And that way I can have a little more artist tweak control over that. And I can adjust the overall contribution of the fog. But in this case, I think that like in a lot of times, it's going to be the sky color that actually produces a fairly natural look. So that ends up being something that makes sense to do in a lot of cases. So I'm going to go ahead and reduce the height of the fog down a little bit. So it's just a less extreme fog. Obviously, if you add something like a linear fog, the way that these work is that you can add this new setting. You can enable all of those settings. But if you have different volumes, you can also decide which elements are overriding which other elements. So like if I only wanted to affect like the fog density and I had another volume in the scene that was controlling this, I could just edit the density by itself. But you do want to keep in mind that, for example, if I'm using linear fog here, my visual environment has to reference it. So I have to select linear fog and then my settings that relate to the linear fog settings will actually be what controls my fog outcomes. So fog start height, fog end height. These are a little bit different because in this one, it's not an exponential height growth. You actually pick like the minimum and maximum ranges, and then you get to change settings that are more like specifically related. So for example, this one I can actually have my fog start at 1 and then end at 4. And you'll notice technically, if you see it in the distance there, that it's actually, it can produce a cutoff where you actually see fog up close. So like, for example, my fog start at 14 but end at 1. I can actually have fog that's only up close and not farther away. Now, if you add in volumetric fog, this one is going to be a little bit more involved. So if I switch to volumetric fog, you may not actually have a really great idea of like what's going on here, because there's a lot of different elements that relate to that, and that's a whole more complicated thing. So we'll actually discuss that some other time, how to set up volumetric fog, because it's a little more involved. But okay, so then the other thing you'll notice is this has this baking sky script added to that. That's just to make sure that the sky is actually being correctly captured when you're baking your lighting settings. So it's actually including the procedural sky or whatever other sky element. So if we had a HDRI sky, we would include that as well. But like, okay, so I just made this point that there's a reason that this is useful. And I don't want to just state that without having any basis for it. So I want to make sure that you see why there is some advantage to having these settings kind of broken up here versus the way that they were previously. Because, I mean, these all look basically the same as what they used to have. So you might ask the question, well, why do you need to even change this? Why didn't they just use the system they used before? And the answer is really that there's like tons of cool things that you can do when you have control over how this system functions. So I'm going to go ahead and create rendering. And I could say, for example, I could create a density volume. That's probably not useful. So I'm going to just create an empty game object. I'm going to rename this night volume. And then I'm going to go to add component, and I can select volume and type in the filter. And then in this case, I'm going to select is global, so it'll apply to everything. And then I have a weight value of 1. And I'm going to make this a priority of 1 instead of 0. So my scene settings have a priority of 0, and that means that my priority of 1 will actually be higher priority than the 0. So it needs a profile, and while the scene settings came in with a default one, I can go and I can just create a new profile, and it'll be named after whatever the volume that I created is, the game object itself. Now, I always hate where those things get created, but that gets created actually in my scenes folder, the one for this sample scene. It's going to be actually in there. And in some cases that you're going to want to extract those out into like a configs folder or something like that so that you have broader control. But by default, it assumes that you're making this for this scene. So that works out decently well. But let's go ahead and I'm going to add a component override. And I'm going to go to my visual environment options. I'm going to turn on all of those, so select all. I'm going to go to add another component. I'm going to select a procedural sky, and then I'm going to add another component, and I'm going to make this one exponential fog. And I'm going to enable the settings on all of these so that I can have some proper control over them. So in my visual environment, I want my sky type to be my procedural sky, which will automatically pull the procedural sky that I have, and then the fog type, I want it to be my exponential fog. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly make a change to this lighting environment. In fact, maybe we should have made this like a sunset, but I'll just go ahead and maybe design it after a sunset just so it's a little easier to see. So, okay, so one of the things I can do is for my procedural sky, I can modify the atmospheric thickness if I wanted to. You know, we can make this kind of look darker. I can also modify the sky tint, so I can make it like, maybe we'll make this like almost like it's like a kind of a dusk environment. So I'll add the sky tint there, but I also want to make it look darker overall. So I'm going to make the underground color into kind of like a dark black color. I also want to make it that in general the sky is darker. Yes, I guess I'm kind of doing a nighttime here. And then I also want to use, in this case, I want to use fog to actually make this look more like nighttime. So I can edit the fog distance, for example, and because the sky color seems like it works fine here, I can turn off these values for the color mode. I can increase the height attenuation a little bit. I can make the fog distance go a little further out. And I can make the fog height attenuation a little bit higher so that it's like, so I've got this kind of nighttime environment. Now I haven't even edited the actual light itself, which I could always do. But the part that's neat about this is that now, because I've made this configuration for this environment, I can actually take this weight value and I can shift it back to 0, and then it will take over the settings from the base scene, and I can just, as I want to transition it into this night environment, I can do that very, very easily. Now, maybe I want to do something like, for example, let's go ahead and create another one, and I'm going to do like a sunset. So I'm going to call this sunset volume, and in this case, we're going to also add another volume here, say is global. I'm going to create a new profile, really quickly do what I was just doing before. So I'm going to add in my visual environment. See, this will give you some practice. I'm going to make this procedural sky exponential because I don't actually have to have the components to set them. And then I can go to my component overrides. I'm going to add in exponential fog, add those in, and then we're going to add in our procedural sky. And then check off all of those. So what I want to do is I want to actually make sure that this one displays before the early overrides the earlier one, but is overridden by the night. So I'm going to go ahead and actually I'm going to make this priority 1. I'm going to make the night priority 2, but I'm going to turn the weight down, and now I'm going to work on my sunset volume. This is actually roughly what I've set up now for my day-night cycle in our game. I actually use these volumes and just transition the weights based on which ones I want to be overriding or controlling the current time of day, which is actually really, really, really nice. So I'm going to go ahead and my exponential fog, I'm going to make it a constant color. I'm going to make it kind of a sunset red. I'm going to make the fog closer. Turn the height up a little bit. Again, maybe I can bring it down a bit. I don't need it to be that high. And then I can just make this, the sky, I can tint the sky as kind of a, maybe like an orange or a red. So I'll add some tint to that. And maybe, yeah, so we can decide exactly how we want to do that. Don't want to necessarily tint it too much. And then you can adjust atmospheric thickness, because atmospheric thickness can often get you some neat effects where it actually looks more like it has kind of a gradient in the sky, which actually, so for example, having kind of a blue color here, but with a higher atmospheric thickness, I can actually make it look like it has more accurate sunset look. So let's see. Yeah. Depending on what I want out of my sky. So I'm not going to do anything too crazy. There we go. Yeah, okay. So I think maybe that's maybe a little bit more of a sunset sky, roughly something in that ballpark. Then I can also reduce the overall intensity of the sky if I wanted to. I can also reduce the brightness of the ground, which is just controlling what the shadows, the low lights are. And so obviously I would also want to also edit the directional light settings for this. And so that's not going to be something that you get for free with a volume like this, but you can still hopefully see how you can benefit from some of these settings. So if this is my default scene, I can go ahead and take my sunset and I can weight that in so it starts getting to the sunset time. Then I can take my night sky, I can increase the weight, and then it starts transitioning to the night sky. And then you'll notice right here, actually, in this case, this is a good example of what happens when you enable versus disable certain settings. Because so, right, for example, right here, my sunset volume is actually using constant color instead of sky color. And then my night volume is actually not overriding those. So if I go ahead and enable those, then that makes sure that I actually am getting all of those settings from the night volume instead of from the sunset volume. So obviously this all makes sense with just general settings, right? It's something that seems pretty obvious and significant. But let's ask ourselves the question, well, why would they include all of these other kind of more performance related settings? And I think that if anybody has worked on a game where they needed to make sure that performance was optimized, there's quite a number of situations where you realize like, oh wait, I'm indoors, so I need a totally different setting than I would need for being outdoors. Oh, it's nighttime, so I actually don't need shadows to be displaying as far as they were previously. And so you can actually make those kind of setting changes in these contexts so that they actually optimize your performance further without having anything that's really onerous or requires a lot of programming to do. So under the night volume, for example, I could go to add a component override, and I can add in HD shadow settings. I can turn on all. And in this case, I could make the max distance like... Yeah, so if you see here where the fog is, if I make the max distance 10, you literally can't tell that the shadows are only proceeding for a distance of 10 meters in front of you. And so because of that, I could even possibly take the shadow cascades down, and it would make it maybe a little bit fuzzier, but it wouldn't be anything too drastic. So I could even just do like 2 cascades, and I could make the split a little further away or something like that. Maybe I could even just do no cascades, and I could just deal with the fact that the shadows are just a little bit softer, a little lower res. And in that case, what that means is that then as I transition away from the weight of this, I can actually override some of the other settings. And you'll notice that in this case, what I need to do is I need to be mindful of where those transitions are happening, because so this sunset volume is still using the scene settings here. So if I have my shadow distance being 80, for example, maybe I could change it to like 120. And then you'll notice that as the night settings take effect, this is the only thing that you want to watch out for, is that as the night settings start to creep in, because of that type of setting, it's going to kind of jump. So you want to be a little bit careful about how you're doing that, because a setting like that doesn't have an easy transition just from one value to another, at least in the current iteration of this. So hopefully in the future they will modify that so that the actual max distance gets blended. But at least at the moment it's not doing that, or I'm not aware of a way to do that. So you can do that as an effective option, but you might want to be careful about how you blend it versus having a hard cutoff. Like if you get to your nighttime setting, then you can immediately flip to the reduced shadow draw distance once it's at the point where you can't see it anymore. And so that might be helpful. But yeah, okay, so that's just a rough idea of some of the things that you can do there. And this is cool for anybody who's worked on day-night cycle features for a while, because there's actually a lot that goes into creating those types of things. And this is actually much easier than previously it used to be. So let's go ahead and take a small detour into looking at lighting settings for a second.